Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. What is old is new again, and we're very excited to have back friend of the pod. And now, I think last time he was here, he was at Princeton, but now he's all Mr. Fancy Pants Yale guy. And perfect sort of timing, given that I just recently wrote that we should maybe impeach Joe Biden. He has a new book out. The Impeachment Power, the Law, Politics, and Purpose of an Extraordinary Constitutional Tool. I'm, of course, talking about Keith Whittington. Keith, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Yale is fancier than Princeton, but it is true that I'm now at Yale Law School.
Well, Connecticut's fancier than New Jersey. I'll just put it that way.
It does feel that way so far, I have to admit.
All right. Standard protocol here is that when people have a new book out, and this just came out last month, my first question is always, what's your book about?
Yeah, thanks. So oddly, right, impeachments remain far more relevant than I ever would have imagined. I started writing about impeachments as part of my dissertation, and is one of those dissertation items that you figure you'll never go back to and would never have any continuing interest. And yet we keep talking about impeachments and impeaching people. And so I keep finding myself drawn back to it. And so this book is an attempt to think through how the impeachment power has actually been used in the American context, how it ought to be used in the American context, what we know about the law and politics and history of the impeachment power, and also try to put it into a bit of more of a political context. So think about the impeachment power not simply as a matter of here's what the law is of the constitutional use of the impeachment power, but also how does this fit within the system of checks and balances? What are the alternative tools we might have available to us to remedy particular political problems, in which impeachment might be one of those tools, but it might also be that there are other kinds of things you can do to address the kind of political problem in front of you. So think about the impeachment power more as a political tool for trying to address certain kinds of political problems, rather than think of it purely as a legal device, which is surrounded by a bunch of legal triggers and legal requirements. I think that makes more sense of it as it exists within our constitutional system, as we've used it over time. I think it helps us think through some of the problems that seem to befuddle Congress over the last few years as they've thought about the impeachment power. And really, partially, it's motivated by being frustrated by how Congress has approached the use of the impeachment power the last few years. And I think they have not thought as carefully about what it is they're doing when they think about impeaching somebody and what they're trying to accomplish, and therefore what the best way of trying to accomplish their goals actually would be.
Okay, so to that end, how did the founding fathers view the impeachment power? Where did it come from? What was the historical antecedents that they were drawing on that said this is the way we're going to deal with this? And what did they consider to be impeachable or not impeachable or worthy of impeachment?
Yeah, so the impeachment power is something they sort of took for granted, not something I think that they had theorized very deeply about, but it was part of the British practice, parliamentary practice before, and they assumed it would be part of the American legislative set of powers as well. The American state constitutions drafted during the American Revolution and the revised state constitutions that were drafted after the American Revolution included impeachment powers as a matter of routine, as part of the authorities that state legislatures were recognized as having. The Articles of Confederation, the first federal constitution, did not have an impeachment power, but of course, there was only one branch of government under the Articles of Confederation, and that was the Congress. And so once they start sitting down to revise the Articles and draft the new federal constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, they are committed to having three branches of government as part of that revision. So now you're suddenly going to have an independent judiciary and an independent executive branch. And especially once they sit down and start thinking about the presidency, they start worrying a lot about the possibility that you're going to have somebody exercising a really powerful office for a very long period of time from their perspective. They're operating in a world in which 1-year terms of office is seen as the norm, and anything beyond a year's term of office is seen as really troubling. And they're imagining establishing a presidency that's going to exercise power for 4 years at a time. And so they're really worried about, well, what happens if a president goes rogue and starts abusing power in really terrible ways, and the next election is a long ways away. What should you be able to do under those circumstances? And they think, well, of course, we need to include an impeachment power in the federal constitution, just like we have it in the states and just like they have it in Britain. It needs to be modified to some degree in order to republicanize it. So we don't want to use it in the same way. For example, British Parliament sometimes used it, which is as a matter of criminal law, where the British Parliament could actually impose criminal punishments on people. And they did not want that. And they also wanted to make it consistent with the kind of separation of powers they wanted. So they didn't want the impeachment power to become a weapon that Congress could use to put the president or the courts under the thumb of Congress. And so how do you maintain a system of 3 independent branches while also having some kind of check built in that would allow Congress to remove members of the other 2 branches in extreme circumstances? And so they're doing this balancing act of how do we include impeachment power, which they think they for sure need, with a particular problem of an abusive president in mind, but not make it so easy to use that Congress might abuse it. And as a consequence, get an upper hand on the president in ways that would be problematic for the kind of political system they're trying to establish. And so they sort of settle on the system that we have now, of course, in which you have 2 chambers exercising the power, and the power to impeach is held by the House and is relatively easy to secure because you only need a simple majority. But the power to actually convict and remove somebody from office has to be exercised by the Senate and is much more difficult to accomplish because you need a supermajority in the Senate to accomplish it. And then, of course, they establish a very small set of rules, but a few rules and qualifications as to how the impeachment power ought to be used. Notably, that Congress has to meet a standard of finding somebody guilty of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors in order to convict and remove them.
Okay, so 2 questions, and I'll ask them both because I'll forget the other one if I don't just do them back to back. First of all, isn't part of the problem that Britain didn't have impeachment power for kings, and that the presidency is too monarchical, or is sort of monarchical in its structure and power? And then second, what the hell did the founders mean specifically by misdemeanors or high crimes and misdemeanors?
Right. So let's start with the king problem, right? Right, the British Parliament can't impeach the king, but they can impeach ministers, and they use that as a mechanism increasingly to try to control the king to some degree. As I talk about in the book, it turns out there's some real limitations on Parliament's ability to actually do very much to control the king simply using the impeachment power. And so we eventually evolve ourselves in Britain into a parliamentary system where you have a different system of accountability for trying to restrict ministers instead of trying to rely on this impeachment power. But that hadn't evolved yet and didn't exist as a model for the founders to be drawing on. So the only thing they have to look at is something like the impeachment power. And it is true that the presidency is different than a king in the sense that the president is subject to the impeachment power in a way a king's not. And that does reflect in part one of the republicanizing features of the American constitutional system and how the impeachment power gets transferred into the American system, that you don't imagine that there are any public officers that are beyond the scope of the impeachment power that can't be removed. Instead, we think it's checks and balances all the way through the system. Nobody is above that in the way that the king might be. And so even though the president's very important and you don't want to disrupt the ability of the president to do his job, it's still the case. They needs to be accountable. And so we subject them to elections every 4 years. And likewise, we subject them to the possibility of being removed before an election through the context of an impeachment. So in that sense, no kings in America. You want something that's weaker than that and more accountable than that. And partially, I think, and part of the argument of the book is that one thing the impeachment power symbolizes in the American constitutional system is ultimately the supremacy of Congress within that system of three independent branches. Only one branch of government is empowered to remove members of the other branches of government, and that's Congress. That's the one institution that we trust to say you can remove other branches of the government if push comes to shove. We don't let the president remove members of Congress. We don't let the courts remove members of Congress, nor do we let presidents remove members of the court. Only Congress has that. And they ultimately are democratically accountable. And so at the very heart of the system is this very Republican commitment to say the most Republican branch of government has authority over the other branches of government, including in this very extreme case of actually removing people from office. On the misdemeanors question, I think the best way of thinking about this is the high crimes and misdemeanor is a kind of term of art and exists as a package. So we shouldn't be thinking about, as we normally would, misdemeanors as a separate entity, but instead it's a phrase, and it exists and works as a phrase. It's one that does not have a lot of robust history in British parliamentary practice, but it's something that had developed in British parliamentary practice by the time of the American founding. And so it was a phrase they could reach to say, well, here's what this means in Britain. But there's actually not a lot of content as it had been developed in British parliamentary practice at that time either. And so really it's best understood, I think, as a kind of token for we mean the kind of thing that the British Parliament has in terms of the scope of offenses that can be reached by this power. And that's left us as scholars, as politicians, as citizens, with a great deal of uncertainty about how to think about this power over time. I think all of our serious debating about what the scope of the impeachment power is winds up turning on how do we give content to high crimes and misdemeanors in particular. We relatively rarely find ourselves impeaching people or threatening to impeach people because of treason, bribery. We mostly find ourselves wanting to impeach people because of high crimes and misdemeanors. And so as a consequence, we find ourselves arguing about what does high crimes and misdemeanors really mean.
So isn't it a legal doublet, right? Legal doublets are those, for listeners that don't know, they're kind of fascinating little history to it. Most of them, or a lot of them, are terms from English history that are one's in like an English word and the other one is a Romance or French word. And so there are all these like really like I just called it up like Law and Order, deem and consider, demise and lease, depose and say, legal and valid, lewd and lascivious, liens and encumbrances, waif and stray. A lot of people don't know that one. Ways and means, will and testament. And it was a way to sort of incorporate French speakers. The courts were still largely in French or Latin, but the English common law English language was becoming more prominent. And so it was a way to sort of be inclusive of everybody. And so misdemeanor has come to mean in America like a minor crime.
Right.
But it didn't mean that at the time. It was just a term of art to encompass really bad behavior, right? Criminal behavior of some kind, right?
Right. So even the term misdemeanor, even standing alone by itself, has meant something different than in the sense that, as you say, it sort of represented a much wider range of crimes we think of as relatively minor crimes. That's not how they were using the term even misdemeanor. And then, as you say, sort of high crimes and misdemeanor as a combined phrase is in some ways a kind of kitchen sink. It's,
Right.
we'll throw everything in there that might be some kind of abuse of power or serious example of misconduct, and throw it under the scope of this British authority. And of course, if you look at British history, British parliamentary history on the impeachment power also evolves over time. So they are across time trying to figure it out themselves as to what's the scope of this authority, when can we use it, what kinds of things are encompassed within it. The language that they use to describe the power changes over time. And so it's not like it's ever had a very stable meaning. It's something that is was developing and contested within British history. And then by the time of the American founding, it had sort of stabilized, and you had these kinds of terms of art that had become associated with it, like high crimes and misdemeanor. And so the founders were borrowing from that relatively stabilized practice. But even then, it was not as clear, I think, as one might like. It's certainly not the case. You can just look at Britain and say, oh, well, here's what they meant, and carry it over. And moreover, the Americans, as soon as they started trying to impeach people, they pretty quickly figured that out, because then they actually started looking at the British history more carefully and try to say, oh, well, we have this impeachment power we borrowed from Britain. I guess we ought to, if we're going to use this thing, we ought to look over there and see how this works and what the procedures are, and those kind of things. And then they realized this isn't very well worked out in Britain either. So we're sort of winging it a little bit.
So, was there ever a time, among the founders, did they ever consider that it had to actually be a violation of criminal law to be impeachable?
So I don't think there's much evidence at all that anyone's thinking in terms of this has to be a violation of criminal law at the time of the constitutional drafting and the ratification. This is an argument that gets marshaled very quickly in our history. So as soon as you start trying to impeach officials for things that are not crimes in ordinary law, unsurprisingly, their defense attorneys start arguing, like Donald Trump's defense attorneys start arguing, is, wait a second, you can't do that. We should understand the impeachment power to be limited to actual ordinary crimes. And Congress has never accepted that as a reasonable argument. It's always been sort of a minority position asserted mostly by people who find themselves in the dock for things that are not criminal offenses and are trying to get themselves out of an impeachment conviction. But if you look at the early constitutional debates in the drafting in Philadelphia, for example, which is where it's talked about much more than it's talked about in the ratification debates. It's mentioned a little bit. There's a little bit of discussion in the ratification debates, but it's not something that's elaborated on a great deal in the ratification debates either. But during the ratification debates and in the Philadelphia Convention, it's clear that what everybody's worried about is not the possibility of government officials committing ordinary crimes, and therefore we need some extraordinary power to deal with that kind of problem. The thing they're really worried about is the possibility of powerful government officials abusing their office in really serious ways, and in ways that you can't tolerate them remaining in power for any extended period of time under those circumstances. And so what do you do about a president who's becoming a dictator is really at the heart of their concern. And people like Benjamin Franklin are saying, well, look, the traditional way of dealing with government officials who are becoming dictators is you assassinate them, or you have revolutions. And it'd be nice if we didn't have to do that. And so couldn't we develop a system in which we had better ways of dealing with that problem than having to rely upon assassinations and revolutions? And the answer was, well, we could design this impeachment power. In which Congress, through a pretty routine legal process, could remove an officer who we are worried about is going to have is going to abuse power in that kind of way. And so if what's working in the back of their mind is, what do we do about the potential dictator who's going to be occupying the presidency? You can't limit yourself to ordinary crimes in any meaningful way. That the kinds of things they're most concerned about are not necessarily ordinary. There may be some ordinary crimes that get committed as part of that process, but that certainly is not the entire category of things that they're concerned about. And as later commentators wound up increasingly emphasizing, including, for example, Joseph Story, very influential Supreme Court justice, as well as constitutional commentator in the early Republic, is you can't anticipate all the ways in which somebody might abuse their office. And so not only do we need to include what he calls political offenses, what we might simply think of as abuses of office, but may include some slightly larger variety of things as well. But he also emphasizes, even if we tried to sit down and come up with a list, here's all the things that you're not allowed to do if you're president of the United States and could subject you to impeachment. It would be a mistake to try to do that because some creative future president would find themselves doing something that you left off the list,
Right.
and then you'd be in a pickle. And you don't want to be in precisely the pickle that the founders are worried about, which is you don't want to say, we've tied our hands such that we have no other alternative now than to engage in a revolution to deal with this guy. And so instead, we want the impeachment power to be as broad and as encompassing enough to deal with the creativity of the potential dictators who might find themselves holding political office.
So, I mean, I mean this only slightly glibly. Why have we screwed it up so bad? And what I mean by that is never had a president successfully impeached and removed.
Right.
And the winning argument always is, well, it's not actually a crime.
Right.
Or can't overturn the will of the people. This is sort of what I was partly getting at with the whole Kingly thing is we've kind of screwed up and made presidents elected kings for 4 or 8 years, and therefore we think it's like this incredibly draconian thing to remove them, and Congress has chickened out every single time. And the argument, and particularly in the cable news era, right? I mean, a very small sample set of presidential impeachment. This argument where the lawyers come in, but the lawyers have screwed this up, and said, no, it's got to be a crime. That argument seems to win the day. And I think it's a nonsense argument, but it's also the argument that wins. So, like, should it be easier to impeach or remove a president? Does the impeachment power really work anymore? I mean, how healthy is it as a clause of the Constitution?
So I think not nearly as healthy as the founders would have hoped it would be, to be sure. And I think some of the problem is that we've screwed it up. And some of the problem is that it turns out we have found better tools than the founders imagined we would have. And so there's some bad news, but also some good news as to why we don't impeach presidents more often. And it's part of what I do want to try to talk about in the book. And I should just emphasize that I'm currently at Yale Law School, but I'm a political scientist by training. And so part of the point of the book is we need to take the impeachment power away from the lawyers and think of it more like a political scientist, think of it more like James Madison would have, which is it's part of our system of checks and balances. And it's not simply a legal mechanism as such. And so we shouldn't think of it purely in the way in which lawyers on cable TV think we ought to talk about it. So let's start with the ways in which we screwed it up, right? So because I think those are real, and the presidency I think highlights that to the greatest degree, right? So we should bear in mind that most of the impeachments we have had at the federal level throughout American history have not been presidents, but have been judges, and mostly lower level judges who are committing fairly ordinary offenses of various sorts, some of them criminal, some of them not necessarily criminal. And one of the problems of judges within this schema is that they have lifetime appointments. And if they choose not to resign, the only other mechanism for getting rid of them is by impeaching. And so we have had some stubborn but misbehaving judges over time, and that's required Congress then to trot out the impeachment mechanism as a way of getting rid of those folks. By contrast, if you have cabinet officials, for example, who misbehave in various ways, the president just fires them.
Right.
And so if you can imagine a world in which that wasn't true, in which presidents didn't fire them for whatever reason, or, for example, we imagined a world in which we decided that presidents couldn't unilaterally remove cabinet officials, which is something people talked about at one point, then the impeachment power would be the only way of getting rid of those people, and we'd be impeaching cabinet members a lot more through American history. So the impeachment power has been very productive and useful, but it's very hard to use against the president in particular. And so why is that the case? And I think the founders didn't fully anticipate how hard it would actually be to impeach and remove a sitting president, in part because they did not anticipate political parties. And so they didn't anticipate the extent to which even misbehaving presidents would have a bunch of natural allies who would rally around them. And so they certainly worried about the possibility of a president surrounded by a bunch of toadies
Right.
who would do their bidding. And that's in part their concern was precisely presidents who are surrounding themselves with a bunch of toadies are precisely the people you need to be impeaching and removing because they're quite dangerous for that reason, right? So they understood that kind of problem, but what I don't think they really fully anticipated was the way in which parties would alter the incentives of elected representatives and how they would behave relative to the presidency, and just how difficult it would become to impeach and remove a sitting president as a consequence of partisanship in particular. But there is also good news, and that's probably not the whole story, but I think that's an important part of the story about why we've sort of gone wrong. I mean, lately, I think we've also gone wrong some just because we've misconceptualized the impeachment power, and the book in part is about trying to straighten that out a little bit. But I actually think Congress, over the course of its history, has been a little better than one might imagine about understanding the nature of its own power in this regard, even if lately they have not been great about it. But the good news on the impeachment power is the founders were really thinking if you had a president who was abusing power in various ways or exercising power that didn't properly belong to him from a legal perspective, one, they had a psychological theory that imagined anybody who would do that is somebody who wants to be a dictator. And so the only thing you can possibly do under those circumstances is take the most drastic measure to remove that person and isolate them from power as you possibly can. And it turns out, I think that psychological theory about abuse of power is probably wrong, right? That we've encountered lots of examples of presidents and other government officials who exercise power that doesn't properly belong to them or abuse powers in various ways. And it turns out they're not all budding dictators. They aren't necessarily committed to maximizing their power. And as a consequence, it is possible to check them in more limited ways. And so if you imagine they're all budding dictators, they're all would-be Hitlers and Stalins, then of course the thing you got to do is remove them from power completely.
Right.
If instead you think, no, they're just screwing up, and maybe in some very important ways, but they're making mistakes of various sorts, or they're going off on the wrong track in various ways that we need to rein them in. But they're not budding Hitlers and Stalins, then it means that it's also possible that we can find other tools that can actually be pretty effective in remedying those problems. And so we use the impeachment power a lot less than I think the framers might have imagined we would, given how common abuses turn out to be. Right? They also hoped abuse of power wouldn't be that common, but it turns out actually abuse of power is probably pretty common over the course of American history. So again, another feature of working constitutions they didn't really quite imagine correctly. It turns out abuses and violations of the Constitution are not that common, or not that uncommon. Instead, they happen pretty routinely. And so how do we deal with that? Well, it turns out we deal with it through things like judicial review. So instead of looking to impeach the president, we instead file a lawsuit, and we go to court and we tell the court, look, this executive branch is misbehaving in these ways. They violated the scope of their authority in these ways. Can you tell them to stop? And courts do. And then the executive branch stops. And so it has proven to be a pretty effective remedy for a lot of things the founders would have imagined. No, you've got to dial this up to 11. And the only way you're going to solve this problem is to remove these terrible people. And it turns out we've found other ways of trying to address those problems that they're easier to use. They're more modest in their effects. They don't require removing the person, but instead just requires correcting the specific action that they've taken. And so we've relied much more heavily on those kinds of tools instead of the impeachment power. And so the good news of the constitutional story, the bad news is I think we violate the Constitution a lot more than founders ever would have imagined.
Right.
The good news is we've also designed a whole bunch of ways in which we can keep the Constitution more or less functioning, despite the fact that we have officers who abuse their power and who violate the law and violate the Constitution on various occasions. And it turns out the impeachment power, as the British figured out as well, the impeachment power is not the most efficient mechanism for doing that. And so you would hope you find other tools that work better most of the time.
That's a helpful point, right? I mean, the impeachment is essentially capital punishment politically. And it turns out that, like, since everybody's not necessarily wanting to become a king or a dictator or a tyrant or whatever, you don't necessarily have to punish or curtail bad behavior with the political equivalent of capital punishment. I think it's a good point.
And it's useful, right? I mean, so imagine you have a president, for example, who is trying to erase student loans without proper legal authority. And you might
get my
imagine
head around that for a second. That's still, yeah.
Right. So no, it's possible to imagine, but imagine such a thing happens, right? And one kind of solution to that problem is you remove that president, right? Because you can't trust him with power anymore. Anyone willing to do that has demonstrated they can't be trusted with power, and you just got to get rid of him. The other option is you say, well, he does a lot of other things we like, but he's really screwing up this one. And if we go to court, we can get something that's much more specific and direct, and it deals with that very specific problem, and then we can move on. And so we tend to do it that way. And so if you had a president, for example, that we really think, for example, he's blowing past courts, he just ignores court orders, then you would think, okay, well, then relying on judicial review is not going to help us very much anymore. We got to be looking for some stronger medicine to deal with this particular problem. Or he's just abusing power all over the place. So it's not just one isolated thing, but instead, this is a person that, in fact, takes every opportunity to abuse power. I think under those kinds of circumstances, you really have to think, okay, the other kinds of tools we use under more normal circumstances aren't going to work very well anymore. And we better be able to use something like the impeachment power under those kinds of circumstances. And at that point is where you might start getting kind of pessimistic that maybe given the nature of our partisan politics, even if we find ourselves encountering that kind of situation, we may still not muster the political will to actually use this power that the founders thought would be essential under some circumstances.
But strictly speaking, in terms of, so part of the thing that is annoying about the debates about high crimes and misdemeanors and what's impeachable and not is that at the end of the day, something's impeachable if Congress decides it's impeachable, right? Because the Supreme Court's not going to get in the middle of that. It's essentially not justiciable, right? Which means courts aren't going to review an impeachment.
I hope so. And I argue in the book that they shouldn't. Right. And so this ought to be something that Congress has the last word about. The Senate, I think, is the final constitutional court for resolving questions relating to impeachments. And so it is the Senate that occupies the role that we normally often attribute to the U.S. Supreme Court in this regard. I think it's a mistake, therefore, to think that there's all bets are off. There are no constitutional rules here. There's no point in making constitutional arguments. Just because the Senate's the one exercising power doesn't mean they don't necessarily take their constitutional responsibility seriously. You can't make arguments to them. It just means that they're the ones who have the final say, not the U.S. Supreme Court and a bunch of justices having the final say.
I would argue that the Senate takes its constitutional role, this is a weird way of putting it, too seriously. It thinks that this is such a big deal that they're terrified of doing it for reasons other than violations of criminal law. And it's worth reminding people that there were only 3 criminal laws when this country was federal laws when this country was founded, right? It's like treason, copyright infringement, right?
Probably piracy pretty early.
And piracy,
right? I mean,
yeah.
so they're right. I mean, and it is a point that Joseph Story makes even several years, 3-4 decades later, by the time he's writing the constitutional commentaries, he's still making that point, which is to say that the federal statute book, the federal criminal code, is very small. And
Right.
it's kind of haphazard, right? And so you sort of are just creating new criminal laws as new violations are occurring, and people say, "Oh, there ought to be a law about that." And so, as he points out, right, if that's all you can use, you've got a very few things that you could legitimately impeach a president for example, if all you can rely upon is the federal code, because the federal code is tiny at that point in time. Well, now the federal code is much bigger, and so we've got a lot more criminal code you could potentially rely on, but it still doesn't capture the range of things that we would want to take into account when we think about can we tolerate this person continuing to exercise political power for the next 3 years, for example.
Yeah, see, I would prefer if we started to think of the impeachment power as a form of civic hygiene rather than, political regicide.
Right.
Because, first of all, if like the debates over, I mean, I think I had you on to talk about them back during at least one, if not both, of Trump's impeachment. This idea that, well, he's on his way out the door, so therefore nothing he does on the way out the door is worth impeaching, is lunacy to me. Right? Yeah. You can do a lot of bad things on your way out the door, and if you take it as a given that you can't or won't be impeached for them, that is an incentive to do more of them. And,
you can do a lot of terrible things in a pretty short period of time. And so there are circumstances where you can imagine, look, we may only have 2 weeks left of this guy's term of office, but 2 weeks is still too much. And we can't possibly tolerate letting this person hang around even for that amount of time, given the threats that they pose to their office. But there's also a political hygiene point, just in the sense of, I think, establishing and reinforcing norms, right? And so partially you might use the impeachment power, and I think we have historically used the impeachment power sometimes, not necessarily because we think this person is too dangerous to leave in place for the next, 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, whatever it happens to be, although that's the thing the founders are most concerned about. But also in the sense of, we're going to use this impeachment power in order to send a message that we don't want office holders who occupy these kinds of offices behaving in these kinds of ways. This kind of behavior that this person is engaged in is unacceptable. And people going forward should know that this is unacceptable, and Congress is putting down some markers about what proper political behavior looks like for certain kinds of office holders. And the impeachment power can be an effective tool for helping to reestablish some political norms surrounding some political behavior. And I think it's part of the justification, for example, for even thinking about a late impeachment, like in Trump's case, the second impeachment, he was impeached before he left office, but he wasn't, depending on what you count as formally the timing of an impeachment.
Right.
But which there is a technical argument there potentially. But regardless, the Senate trial occurs after he's left office, and you might think, well, at that point he's already left office. There's nothing left to do because he can't be removed anymore. So what's the point of having a trial? And I think part of the point of having a trial under those circumstances is because it still is an opportunity to expose misdeeds and to condemn those misdeeds as being inappropriate for a government official to have engaged in. And that's part of what you want the impeachment power to be potentially available to do. So its first and primary purpose is to remove officials in emergency situations where you got to remove them right away. But there are other things you can accomplish with the impeachment power, and other reasons why we have used it across time, and a kind of political hygiene that doesn't necessarily even involve removing the officer in question is part of that.
Yeah, I mean, just cards on the table. I think Mitch McConnell made a grave error in not following through and encouraging others to follow through with convicting Donald Trump interfering with the peaceful transfer of power is a bad thing for presidents to do. Sending the signal purely as a matter of civic hygiene, although, and now it turns out it would have actually prevented him from getting reelected. And I think if you put truth serum in Mitch McConnell, he would say, yeah, I blew that.
Yeah.
But so this gets to
he
something.
sort of assumed the political system would take care of the problem for him. That Trump would go away quietly and would disappear into the wilderness and never be heard from again, which struck me as a extraordinarily bad gamble to be making at the time he was making it. Certainly was not what I was recommending at the time. And moreover, it's a missed opportunity in the sense of you actually would like to get Republican senators, in this case in particular, to go on record and say, this is a very bad thing and presidents shouldn't do this kind of thing in the future. And, they whiffed and weren't willing to do it.
Yeah. I mean, and when you say Mitch McConnell thought the political system would take care of things, he was the political system. Like the Senate was the political system, and he should have tried harder to take care of things. And
he had a responsibility in this context, right? But, and senators, part of the frustration of our current political moment, right, is government officials not wanting to exercise the responsibility that they are supposed to be exercising. And so when you see senators now talking about, well, my job is just defer to the president, whoever he nominates to particular offices, it's like, you actually have some responsibilities in this office, and among them is the responsibility to exercise an advice and consent role relative to nominees, and not just wave them through. And likewise, I'm sorry that it's hard and complicates your life, but sometimes you actually have to sit in an impeachment trial and make some hard judgments, and maybe even cast some votes that are politically tough to cast. But that's the job.
So, as a point of personal privilege, I want to ask you about something. So, I wrote, and I even wrote in the first paragraph, I think, that I was writing with at least a soupçon of Swiftian prose, right? Which is, I thought, I kind of cue that I'm mostly serious, but not entirely serious, right? But I made the case that that the Democrats should take not only that should Biden be impeached for his pardon of Hunter Biden, but the Democrats should take the lead on doing so. And part of the reason, so first of all, if you go back and you look at the ratification debates in Virginia, you'll see that George Mason raised it, who's an anti-federalist, right? And the anti-federalists didn't like the pardon power. And they said, you can get a president who will pardon people who are doing things at his bidding and absolving them from, punishment for it, which is almost exactly what Trump did with January 6th.
Yeah.
Or wants to do with January 6th.
Yeah.
Right. And, but also pardoning your own son, not just for crimes he's actually been convicted of, but crimes that he may have committed, including, at least allegedly, very allegedly, that Biden himself, the president himself, was involved in, and his family was involved in. That is really in the meaty part of the bell curve of things that the founders probably would have thought would be impeachable. And that was Madison's point, was said, if you do, if the president abused his pardon power, that the president could be impeached for it. Well, the odds that you're going to abuse your pardon power at the end of your term rather than at the beginning of it are very much higher because of the things we discussed before. And so as a matter of civic hygiene, sacrificing Joe Biden to the gods of politics, I think would be smart for the Democrats to do. Yeah. It would be good for the Republic, and it would send a signal to Donald Trump, who very much wants to and enjoys abusing his pardon power as well. The reaction from many readers, let me just say, was unkind. And one of the things I found really remarkable was the degree to which, and so unkind and so irrational, that I am now much more in favor of my position, and I'm willing to throw aside the Swiftian part. But one of the things that a lot of people said to me was, "You idiot, he's on his way out. Yeah. Why would you ever want to do that?" And I guarantee you that 95% of these people were in favor of impeaching Donald Trump in the second impeachment when he was literally out the door.
Right.
And so first of all, what do you think about simply that misusing pardons is what the founders would have considered squarely to be an impeachable offense? Should it be? And what do you think about keeping the pardon? I mean, you can put on your pundit hat if you want and address my central argument, but I know that makes you uncomfortable. But what about the should we be getting rid of the pardon power which really is a vestigial organ of the British past and really doesn't have the same role today, given how much criminal code there is.
Yeah. So maybe I should start with the important power and then circle back to the impeachment question. So I do think the Biden pardon and some of the threatened Trump pardons may highlight the useful need for a constitutional amendment to revise the pardon power. Most of the state constitutions that get written after the founding have a much more limited pardon power built into them for state governors than what we gave to the president. So the early state constitutions tended to do what the federal constitution did as well, and give this very expansive power, which is borrowed from Britain and is seen as having some uses, and it has some uses. But experience at the state level, as well as the federal level, has taught us that executives empowered with this kind of blanket pardon power tend to use it more expansively than we might prefer. And it is subject to abuse, even if it doesn't actually get abused. And so one way you might deal with the possibility of it being abused, which is part of what the founders are thinking, right? So we're going to give the president this big pardon power, but we know that powers can be abused. And one solution to the possibility of powers being abused is you don't give the power at all. But they think that's probably a mistake. We need a pardon power, and we need it to be pretty expansive. The other way you try to deal with it is things like we'll threaten them with impeachment. So if they abuse the pardon power, they can be impeached for it, and that will keep them in line. And one thing that subsequent state constitutional drafters learned was that wasn't very effective. We need better tools than that to try to rein in abuses of the pardon power. And so one way in which we will do it is by creating much more limited pardon powers and much more complicated pardon powers at the state level. So in my teaching, when I teach about the pardon power, for example, I like to contrast the way the state of Texas Constitution does its pardon power compared to how the federal Constitution and some of the East Coast state constitutions do it. The Texas Constitution is not unique in this regard. It mirrors how lots of other constitutions do it. But it has all kinds of restrictions. So it has procedural restrictions. So the governor can only pardon after pardons have been recommended by a separate pardoning board. So the governor is not empowered to self-initiate pardons. They have to rely upon a separate body that reviews and recommends pardons. And moreover, there are lots of limitations on when you can do pardons. So you can't do these kind of preemptive pardons, for example. So a lot of state constitutions bar governors from being able to pardon people who have not yet been indicted for anything. And instead they say, you have to wait till somebody's actually been convicted of a crime, and then you can choose to pardon them. But we don't want preemptive pardons, and there's reasons why you might not want preemptive pardons. There's some downsides to that, and we should be frank about the potential downsides of building in those kind of constraints. So, for example, we might imagine circumstances in which having the capacity to preemptively pardon people is in fact really useful. So you can imagine a Civil War context, for example, in which you're trying to say, how do we bring peace to the country in which we have warring factions inside the country? Well, among the things I may need to do in order to try to build bridges and bring peace is issue some blanket pardons to the guys on the losing side of this battle in order to try to bring them back into the fold and reunify the country. And so you might imagine there are sort of extreme circumstances where you actually want pretty wide-ranging pardoning power under the scope of the president. But it's clearly a power that can be abused, and in lots of circumstances, we've already decided sort of within the American constitutional tradition to think this is not the kind of power we ought to just leave in the hands of a single individual. We ought to contain it in various ways. And it wouldn't be unreasonable to take this as an opportunity to amend the Constitution at the federal level and limit the scope of the president's pardoning power as well. From an impeachment perspective, though, I think you're totally right that abuse of the pardon power is within the scope of the impeachment powers. One of the things the founders anticipated was precisely that the pardon power could be used in very dangerous ways. It could become a tool of potential dictators, and so one reason why you would need an impeachment power is to deal with presidents who are abusing their pardon power by, for example, giving out blanket pardons to flunkies who they then are sending out into the countryside to abuse people in various kinds of ways. And you need to be able to forestall that by removing the person who might use the impeachment power in that way. And it emphasizes the fact that we can't limit the impeachment power to ordinary crimes, because using your pardon power certainly is not an ordinary crime in any traditional sense. It's something only the chief executive have, and is not a criminal act. You know, setting aside bribery and those kind of particular situations. And moreover, it highlights the extent to which part of the point of the impeachment power is to deal with abuses of power. So there's no argument that the president doesn't have an expansive pardon power, and we don't need to make that argument. We can say, yes, this is within the scope of President Biden's authority to issue a pardon like this to Hunter Biden. But it's an abuse of that authority. It's a misuse of his discretion. And it's precisely in those circumstances in which an office holder is misusing their power in these kinds of ways that the founders think you need something like the impeachment power. And that's how we traditionally thought about the impeachment power, is it's useful for precisely those kinds of circumstances in which an officer is misusing a power that they've been entrusted with.
So what did you make?
Just to emphasize the hygiene issue again, right? And part of the point of doing that, including doing it for somebody like President Biden at this point in his tenure, is to send a message to future presidents: don't do this, right? That if you decide you want to abuse your pardon power in this kind of way, it will subject you to the possibility of being impeached and maybe even removed from office under those circumstances. And so you will bear a very heavy political price for engaging in this kind of behavior. And so you should think twice before you do it. And if instead Congress just rolls over and says, oh, well, that was sort of unfortunate, too bad they did that, it will incentivize future presidents to be more aggressive and more abusive of how they exercise the power. Again, we should think about alternative remedies here. So one way in which you say, well, okay, we're not going to impeach Biden, but we want to disincentivize presidents from doing this in the future, is you yell at them a lot, right? And so one way in which members of Congress can try to do this is to try to just make it really politically costly to do this and just say, be very vocal about how terrible this is. This is going to be a big political scandal. It's going to eat up the administration in various ways. And so a future president will look at this episode and say, oh, I don't want to go through all that. And so better to avoid some of this pardon stuff. But the goal here is how do you impose some political costs on a president who might be contemplating engaging in this kind of behavior? And the impeachment power is a big political cost that you could force them to pay for engaging in this. And this is one of the traditional things the impeachment power it can be usefully used to do within the constitutional system.
Yeah, in theory.
In
right?
theory,
I mean,
right.
I mean, like, that's the problem with this. I mean, I'm in violent agreement with you about how to think about the impeachment power, what the founders thought the impeachment power was for, but we've screwed this up, and I think we are in the process of watching us really screw up the pardon power. So much so that I am not a let's amend the Constitution guy about very much, but I'm increasingly of the mind that we should get rid of the pardon power. Or come up with some hybrid thing where maybe Congress can veto it, or you outsource it to a commission, or you redefine what is pardonable to be essentially treason, and that kind of stuff. Or you say you have to admit to a crime, you have to serve to certain, like the guidelines that used to govern how presidents handed out pardons were pretty good, and those have been thrown away by Donald Trump and now by Joe Biden, and so codifying those in law makes a lot of sense to me, or codifying them in the Constitution makes a lot of sense to me. But it is madness to me to say, well, you can't impeach a president for using his authority.
Right.
And so therefore, since he has absolute authority to pardon people, he can pardon anybody for any reason at all. It's a grotesque distortion of Republican virtue and constitutionalism to me.
Yes, I think that's the one really important point to draw out of this episode is reasonable minds can disagree about what the pardon power actually ought to look like, and moreover, even how one ought to respond to this particular pardon. And so I think this pardon is terrible, and significant political repercussions would be highly appropriate under these circumstances. But I understand that some people might come to different conclusions about that. But as was true in some of the thinking about sort of the first Trump impeachment episode that I thought was important here is let's not come to an incorrect conclusion about how the constitutional system ought to operate as a consequence of our conclusions about this specific episode in this way. It's essential that we, I think, going forward, continue to understand that just because presidents have a lawful authority to do something does not mean it's abusive to exercise that authority in particular kinds of ways, and it's not therefore impeachable to exercise that authority in particular kinds of ways. And there were certainly those who were defending President Trump, I think, who were much too quick to sort of assert that if the president has the legal authority to do something, then not only was it not criminal, which I was mostly on board with, but it's also not impeachable, which I think is just a terrible mistake in terms of how we think about the constitutional system of checks and balances generally and what the impeachment power might be good for going forward. And I fear that people can make the same mistake thinking about President Biden under these circumstances as well. So to take this out of something that I don't know anything about, but to take it to the South Korean context, for example, right? So my understanding of the South Korean constitutional system is that within the authority of the president, there to issue a declaration of martial law, and that it's also within the authority of their legislature to countermand that declaration and effectively repeal it. So if you're a president contemplating declaring martial law, right, that's a big move to make. And so one thing it would certainly suggest is it would be abuse of your power to then try to prevent the legislature from being able to countermand it, given the constitutional system anticipates the legislature being able to evaluate that, right? So that looks more coup-like than constitutional. But even assuming, right, that you don't do that step, right? Instead, you just declare the martial law, and then the legislature meets and says, "No, we disagree with that. We're repealing your martial law." It would then be perfectly reasonable for the legislature to come to the conclusion that the kind of person who wants to issue martial law orders when we think it's inappropriate probably can't be trusted to continue exercising the powers of that office and ought to be impeached and removed at that point, right? And so it would not be a reasonable response to say, "Oh, but it was within my lawful constitutional authority to issue the martial law order." Yeah, it was, but it was a terrible, terrible misjudgment, and somebody who makes that kind of terrible, terrible misjudgment cannot be trusted to continue to exercise the authority of this high office going forward. And sometimes we can make that same calculation about American presidents as well. It's not a response to a claim that you have committed an impeachable offense to say, "Oh, well, I was acting within my lawful authority." Okay, but that doesn't resolve the question. It's still a question of, did you abuse your lawful authority, and are you exercising it in ways that suggest you can't be trusted to exercise it going forward?
All right, let me because in the time we have left, I want to sort of illuminate something. So one of my this is all giving me PTSD from the various arguments I've had in the past. But one of my biggest complaints in the second Trump impeachment, was the degree to which people said impeaching Donald Trump would be overturning the will of the 74 million people who voted for him, right? And the assumption there being that, first of all, the 74 million people all voted for the behavior of January 6th or the leading up to it, right? Which they did not do because it had not happened yet. And as the rules of the space-time continuum say, you cannot vote for stuff that hasn't happened yet and that you didn't predict would happen. But
and it's very close to the electoral mandate problem, right? I mean, this sort of thing about how do we infer what the will of the people were when they voted for this, and it's like,
well, I think the whole concept of a mandate is hot garbage.
Yes.
So
I know, which is why it feeds into that. Right? So,
exactly right. So
right.
and so this gets me to this thing. Because many of the people who were most willing and most eager to say overturns the will of the American people and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, are also in other contexts the kind of people who will say,
It's a
Jonah,
republic, not a democracy.
this is a republic, not a democracy.
Yeah,
right.
right.
And yet their argument for why you
Right.
can't overturn the will of people is the hottest Rousseauian democracy worshipping hogwash. Right. So
Yeah.
in your mind,
right.
First of all, what do you think? What is the difference in your mind between a democracy and a republic? And second of all, do you have any? Have you ever heard a really good argument from someone who says that about what they mean by that? Because there's some people who, Yuval has interesting answers. I would have an interesting answer, but they're not the answers that you would expect from the hot takes on Twitter.
So funny you should ask this. I actually have a book manuscript I'm working on, in part about more generally about sort of ideas about the nature of popular government in the United States and among American political elites from sort of the revolutionary period through the Gilded Age, and sort of their worries about how viable is democratic government really, and are we collapsing as a democracy, which turns out to be a surprisingly persistent worry among American politicians and intellectuals all across the American Republic. And as part of that, then also thinking about this question of, and specifically, is there a difference between a democracy and a republic, and how should we think about that difference, and how was it thought about in particular at the time of the founding in the early America? Because there's this argument about the founding generation or the revolutionary generation thought very negatively about democracies. Instead, they liked republics, and so it's a republic and not a democracy. It sort of builds on this historical claim about how people thought about it in this period. And I think the answer partially is complicated. That it turns out, I think that in that time period, which is to say, sort of from the Revolution through the 1800s, say, that when people wanted to talk about bad things associated with popular government, they tended to refer to it as democracy. So democracy was the problematic thing that that popular government could become. But on the other hand, they were often quite happy to talk about democracies as being good things because they just saw it as a version of popular government. And so when they were looking for a negative word to talk about popular government, they would talk about democracy. And that was not how they tended to talk about republicanism. So when they talked about republicanism, they tend to mean a kind of popular government that was good and the good features of popular government. And so it wasn't a sharp distinction between democracy and republicanism, but part of what I think went along with how they conceptualized republicanism more generally and gets built into this kind of thing that reemerges in the 20th century, which is where this lingo of it's a republic and not a democracy, which really sort of originates specifically in the early 20th century, and then gets picked up by the Berkshires and various other things. That their vision of republicanism was one, that there was a popular government foundation, that there was an appeal to the people. This was a kind of popular government as opposed to a monarchy or a hereditary aristocracy or something else. So they would talk about the Republican part of the government being the part that was accountable to the people directly. But they also thought of republics as being popular governments that were subject to the rule of law. It was not simply a system without checks and balances and the like, but instead it was a system of political moderation in which you had built-in constraints on what popular government looked like. So I think there's no single clean answer about the difference between republicanism and democracy in this regard and what it means to say we're a republic, not a democracy. But I think if we were to take seriously the history underlying this, often it's an appeal to we're a system of constitutional checks and balances and a rule of law, and we're not just a system of Rousseauian populism, and whatever the people want today, that's what they ought to get. And so, at the very least, You're absolutely right. I think that the people who are inclined to want to say we're a republic, not a democracy, should never make this kind of argument that we saw surrounding Trump of oh, you're disrespecting the will of however many million Americans actually voted for Trump, nor should they speak in terms of electoral mandates. This is
Right.
what the will of the people are, and the like as well. Instead, elections are about picking a person to exercise a limited constitutional office for a limited period of time, and that's all it is.
Right. Elections are job interviews.
It's a job interview, right? And so it's not. It's a very Jacksonian populist kind of move to argue. No, elections are separately empowering beyond the scope of the office, that I have been endowed by the will of the people to go do X, Y, and Z. No, you were given a job, and the job has boundaries and limits and constraints attached to it, including the possibility that if you misbehave while conducting your job, you might be impeached and removed under those circumstances.
So I agree with all of that. The only thing that I think is important, and you tell me if I'm wrong, right?
Yeah.
You tell me if you disagree, but you use the phrase popular government a bunch of times, which you were correct to do. I'm not saying that you're wrong, but it's important to emphasize I think for listeners, that when you use the phrase popular government, the concept of a popular government, right? It comes from populace, populi, the people, right?
Yes.
That republicanism was, when it starts to come out, and you have the crazy versions in France,
right.
But basically republicanism was the alternative system, the more democratic, as we would understand it, system to monarchy.
Right.
Right. So this idea of talking about a popular system that isn't purely democratic,
right,
at the time it was considered the more democratic option. Right. And that, but, under constraints with constitutionalism, and maybe you could have a constitutional monarchy where there was Republican elements to it that had popular, but still had constraints on both the monarchy and the run amok will of the people.
Right.
And so this is part of my problem with people who say it's a republic, not a democracy. They make it sound like the concept of the republic emerges as somehow oppositional to what we think of as a democracy. And
That's
I
right.
find it really like Mike Lee, and there's parts about Mike Lee I really respect, but he will do this all the time. Whereas, the word vote isn't in the Constitution, and we're a republic, not a democracy. And it's a really weird thing for a sitting senator, a popularly elected sitting senator, to make it sound like this is a really sharp, important distinction. And the people who don't call us a republic are missing something profound about what America is. And yet, we have elections. Everyone's supposed to be, and this is something the left doesn't understand about Trump a lot of the time, is that, or the MAGA crowd, is that they were wrong and they were lied to. But the MAGA crowd, the rank and file MAGA crowd, thought it was an outrage that an election was stolen.
Right.
Right. That they think they're not inconsistent for saying they like democracy when they were ensorcelled and lied to,
right,
because the election wasn't stolen. But they are not, by definition, really, as a matter of logic, not authoritarian dictator wannabes if they're angry about an election being stolen. And so there was this great miscommunication thing going on there. And anyway, I want to shake people by the lapel and say, okay, you're right. We're a republic, not a democracy. Therefore what? What are we going to get rid of?
What
are we going to do differently now that we've conceded this point? And I never get a good answer from people.
No, I think that's right. So part of the challenge, right, is to talk about this is how do you talk about how do you find a nomenclature that doesn't already build in sort of a commitment to democracy or something else, right? So you got to get sort of outside of the Republic of Democracy, which is why I try to sort of talk about popular government in this regard, because they're both understood and have always been understood as democracy and republicanism are ways of talking about a form of popular government, as opposed to, as you say, sort of non-popular forms of government like dictatorships and kings and hereditary aristocracies and the like, right? And so one thing that was true about America was that there was a very broad consensus is we were not going to have one of those old style forms of government that were not popular. We were going to have a form of government that was grounded in the people, and in which government officials were going to be accountable to the people. And for them, both democracy and republics were ways of talking about that kind of government. And then there were subtle distinctions between the two as to how they talked about them. And in part, there were connotations associated with each one that sort of, when they wanted to make certain points, they were more likely to talk about republics and more likely to talk about democracies. And occasionally you get people like John Adams does it, James Madison does it, where they want to say, no, there's this really technical difference we can make between democracies and republics. And I think it just turns out that they were idiosyncratic in that regard. That if you look at Madison in the Federalist Papers, where he wants to talk about, well, republics are really just representative democracies, turns out he's the only one who talks that way. It's just not the common way in which people were thinking about this. But he was, I think, in part of the conventional wisdom of thinking that democracies and republicans are both flavors of a kind of popular government as opposed to monarchical systems or feudal systems or something else. And we are committed to some form of popular government. And then the question is what the details ought to look like. And one reason why the founders would appeal to talking about republicanism, in part, they often would talk about republicanism in order to draw the contrast with monarchies and stuff. And so frequently that's just how they used the language was, we're a Republican government here, in which they mean we're not a monarchy or something like that. But sometimes they would use it in the sense of, we should bear in mind that we're just not mob rule. We're not just going to go out to the crowd and say, who would you like to hang today? And say, or what you want to do. Instead, we're going to be a place where we're going to have constitutions, we're going to have rules, we're going to have elections, we're going to have checks and balances, we're going to have constitutional systems. When presidents, for example, despite the fact that they're elected, abuse their office in various ways, we're going to have mechanisms to remove those people from office. And that's all part and parcel of what we mean by having a republic, ultimately. So yeah, I think that's it is a little. I think it's part of the whiplash of our current moment as well, right? There's this old sort of lingo from the conservative movement that often sort of, which and Senator Lee, I think, seems to be an embodiment of some of this, right? Where he inherits a lot of this lingo from the old conservative movement, and then he's also layered on top of it a bunch of current Trumpian populism, and those things are often rhetorically in some serious tension with one another, and conceptually in various serious tension with one another, and they're not reconciled very well.
Yeah, I mean, when I try to explain it to people, like, you're a political scientist, you know this stuff better than I do, but there are those two conceptions of how Congress is supposed to work, or legislators is supposed to work, and it's this trustee model versus the representative model. And the representative model says, essentially, you are there to do what your voters told you to do, and you're basically a remote control car for your voters. And then the trustee model is the Edmund Burke, Elders of Bristol thing. Or like, no, I owe you my judgment, and I'm going to do what I think is best. And if you think I'm wrong, you can fire me by not reelecting me. And that's Republican to me. There's this idea, I mean, if we're going to make a really subtle distinction, is that small r Republican in the sense of institutional leadership, this idea that you're adhering to the greater good, even if it is against the popular will in a given moment. And the representative model is you are there for essentially the mob. And obviously in a healthy society, in a healthy democracy or republic, there are edge cases. There's a mixture of both, right? I mean, you do owe your voters a certain amount of fidelity. If you say you're going to do X and Y, you should do X and Y. But at the same time, if X and Y turn out to be really, really friggin' bad, you have to say, hey guys, you were wrong, I was wrong, we're not going to do X and Y. And that's what gets lost in this debate.
Yeah, there used to be a thing in the early republic in the United States called a right of instruction that was floated around and sometimes actually even proposed as a potential constitutional amendment and other things and try to formalize it, embody it. But sometimes state legislatures would assert it relative to U.S. senators. For example, back when state legislatures chose the U.S. senators, sometimes you'd see it in more informal context where city councils or just random assemblies of people would assert a right to instruct their representative in various ways. And those all, the right of instruction was understood as being the people who were selecting their representatives, whether they're senators or congressmen or whatever, have a right to tell them how to vote on a particular issue in the legislature. And of course, those representatives tend to want to push back against that and then like that idea very much. But partially in that terminology, right, that was a sense in which that was that the right of instruction was something that would move us further away from the sort of a Republican ideal and more toward a kind of democratic ideal, because it was more of an appeal to just saying whatever the mob wants today, they ought to get. And there should be no filters, no intermediaries, no limitations on it and the like. And it's a very, so from the founding generation, they would have talked about that sentiment as being a very democratic sentiment, and is the terminology I think they would have reached to talk about that kind of thing. I think in more sort of post late 19th century, we probably would reach to sort of the term populism to talk about this. Political scientists actually have various technical terms to talk about this kind of ideal. But sort of modern populism is sort of a version of that, of what I think the founding generation would have just recognized as being kind of democratic sensibility of just saying that the goal of the government in a system of popular government is just to do whatever it is the people want today, and it doesn't matter what the constitutional constraints are. It doesn't matter what the checks and balances are. They ought to just do it. Like I said, political scientists have various sort of technical terms to refer to this, in part because a lot of Latin American democracies look like that.
Right.
And they do not work very well as a consequence. But they have pretty elaborate theories that I think have this kind of populist sensibility of just saying, oh, well, I got myself elected, and as a consequence, I get to do whatever I want for the next 4 years, regardless of checks and balances.
Including extend my term for another 10 years.
Right, and maybe even including extending my term for another few years after that, right? So that is the challenge, right? Once you've sort of said that, it's like, okay, what's the check on doing the next one? It's a longstanding sort of sensibility, I think, within the orbit of popular government. And I think when the founders wanted to talk about that, they talked about it as being a sort of particularly democratic sensibility. But it doesn't really quite mean the same thing we tend to think of as democracy as such.
All right. Thank you for indulging me. I appreciate it.
It turns out you're indulging you means indulging my own things. And so,
well, so be it. The book again is The Impeachment Power, the Law, Politics, and Purpose of an Extraordinary Constitutional Tool. Keith Whittington, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.